We've been looking at Galatians, but we're not going to look at Galatians today. Then why is it up on the screen? Well, because we're going to look at Palm Sunday from a Galatians perspective. Okay, there we go. I don't know that it's ever been done before. But Palm Sunday, let me just tell you this, to introduce Palm Sunday. Did you know that the events of Palm Sunday led to the destruction of Jerusalem 40 years later? Oh, what? It's a little known fact, and I don't know why it's little known, is that Palm Sunday is one of the most important dates in the entire Bible, without question, just without question. And yet, when we think of Palm Sunday, all we think of is going to Sunday school class and little kids with palm fronds, and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, what? It is a key marker in the entire Bible that was talked about coming through the Old Testament and coming into the New Testament. It was absolutely essential on God's calendar that Palm Sunday go down the way it did. So that's what we're going to look at today. We talk all the time about the fact that Resurrection Sunday, which we'll celebrate next week, is really on the timeline of all of history, of all recorded history, probably the most important spot on that entire thing. Everything before and after changes. But I'd say second most on that calendar is Palm Sunday. It's that important. So we're going to look at it today. We're going to come into it from the Galatians perspective, and this is how I want to do it. We looked a while ago in Galatians about the fact that this promise had been made to Abraham and extends forward, and God says to Abraham, we saw this a couple weeks ago in Galatians, in Genesis 17, verse 7, God speaking, I'll establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants. He's speaking to Abraham and his descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant. See, it doesn't stop, an everlasting promise. To be God to you and to your descendants after you, I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. That's primarily the promise. And as we looked at this, we looked and saw there's God saying, this is part of his promise, his half of the promise. I'll be God to you and to your descendants. I'll be their God. And in this sense, what he's doing is he's saying, from an ancient perspective, I'll be your king. I will be your king. I'll be in charge of all of you. And then he also, in the middle of this, says, I'll give you this land. Well, that's the promise of this kingdom. So God is very much saying to Abraham, as we looked a couple weeks ago in Galatians, that the essential promise to Abraham, which is extended all the way to us today, is God says, I want to be your God, and will you be my people? And it's a kingdom idea is what it is. And he's saying it right here. We saw it another place. We brought up Leviticus 26. Moreover, this is God speaking again, I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul will not reject you. I'll also walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. So that last phrase keeps coming back over and over in the Old Testament, okay? Over and over. I'll be your God, you'll be my people. If you'll be my people, I'll be your God. This is what we call this mutual possession, is what it is. Very much like marriage, a mutual exclusive possession. If you will exclude all others and save yourself for me and be mine, then I will exclude all others and I'll be yours. So it's really a marriage idea, but it's really a king idea at the largest level. He goes on in Jeremiah 30. Now, this is way much later, past all that stuff. Jeremiah is about 500 years before Jesus. He says, you shall be my people, I will be your God. This is the promise, the essential nature of the promise, starting from Abraham through the nation of Israel and extending to us. Later in Jeremiah 32, I'll rejoice over them to do them good and will faithfully plant them in this land with all my heart and with all my soul. So God's excited about the fact that he has this idea to have what I've been calling this new tribe of people who want to have a civilization, a society who God will be in the center of. A whole society with God at the center. And God says, if you'll be my people, I'll be your God. So that's been the promise, and that extends from the Old Testament. Starting from Abraham, that's Genesis 11, that's early Bible, all the way through Jesus and up to us. That's what we've been looking at. He goes on and says in Genesis 22, and in your seed, Abraham, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you've obeyed my voice. And we find, as we've been reading through Galatians, that promise that he extended to Abraham and through the nation of Israel is actually fulfilled in Christ and made available to all of us. The promise goes to Christ, and Christ offers it to us. So that's what we've been seeing. We can actually join in this promise that went to Abraham to be in this new society with God as its center. So here's what we've been saying. This is, by the way, a gigantic wrap-up of the last 2 months. Here's what we've been saying. What's the whole deal about Israel in the Old Testament? Israel was meant to be a model tribe. And I'm not talking about like, a railroad model, a little tiny thing, like that. They built a housing development behind us when I was growing up. And when they started the housing development, the first house they built right in the entry to the streets, they called that first house they built their model home. And I thought, well, but it's a normal size. I thought models were small, But it's a model home, not because it's a fake home. It's a full home. It had all the things a real home has. It was just the first home so that buyers who wanted to come in and buy lots and build houses, they could say, what kind of house will we be promised by the contractor? And they'd walk you in the model home and say, just like this. So in that sense, Israel was meant to be a model nation for all mankind, where God could say, I'm inviting you all through this promise to Abraham and on, I'm inviting you all to be part of this new tribe, this new society, where I'll be at its center, and you'll be my people, and I'll be your God. And we would say, okay, but what does that look like? And he'd say, did you see Israel? It's kind of like that. Now, that's the long and short of why Israel even exists in the entire Bible, but as a model to tell us what life is like. Now, is the nation of Israel a false, small, tiny version of the promise? No, it's a full-blown version of the promise, like the model home. It's a full promise in that sense. So the promises to Abraham and to the nation of Israel, they're real. But that has been expanded to all mankind as we look at the model and say, I want to be part of that too. So that's what we've been studying in Galatians for the last couple months. And that's what brings us here. So the model tribe was inviting all mankind to participate with the tribe at whose center is the Creator God himself, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's the short story. Well, now, the model tribe is there and something bad happens. So now we're going to give you an entire review of the Old Testament, just to get ready for Palm Sunday, because it's that important. Here's what happens. 1 Samuel 8. The people say to Samuel, the prophet, now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. See, they didn't have a king at the time. In fact, they were just coming out of a whole period of the period of judges, they call it. Nasty time where no one was really in charge. And the book of Judges says over and over, without this king, there was no king in Israel. There hadn't even been a first king in Israel. They said that during the period of Judges, people basically did what they thought was right. And when you read the book of Judges, you realize that's a train wreck. Over and over and over. If you've never read the book of Judges, I always liken it as being the comic book section of the Old Testament. It's the craziest. You just can't believe what goes on. But it also has the most incredible stories. Oh my gosh. You know what I'm going to reveal a little truth here. You know what I do on Mother's Day every year? I read Judges in the section where it's about Deborah. Because Deborah calls herself the mother to Israel. Now, if you read why Deborah is famous in Judges, it'll blow your mind. So I read Deborah for Mother's Day. But anyway, Judges is a crazy place. At the end of the judge period, they said, we've had enough of this. We want a king like everybody else has. We want a king. And that's what they're asking for right now. Is that good or bad? Well, Samuel the prophet, he reacts in chapter 8 of 1 Samuel. He says, but the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, okay, listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they've said to you, for they haven't rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. They always did have a king, and it was God himself. That was the intention. Remember the new tribe? If you'll be my people, I'll be your God. God is king and center of the society, the provider of the land and the protection. He was always supposed to be king. And they said, no, we don't want that king anymore. We want a man king. Yeah, we want a man king. A guy who can ride around on a horse and look really cool in battles and stuff like that. I mean, we want a man king. We don't want a God king. So Samuel gets kind of bent out of shape right here. But the whole idea of Israel having a king who is God goes out the window right here. Goes out the window. So what do they get? They get this guy named King Saul. Ooh. And if you've read through that section of 1 Samuel, you realize that 1 Samuel's telling us that King Saul was himself a train wreck for the nation. But why? Was it wrong to have a king? Not necessarily. The problem was King Saul took the place of God as king in the nation. Here's a short form of what happened in 1 Samuel 13. But now your kingdom shall not endure. This is talking to Saul. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart. And the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. So clearly in the nation of Israel, if you're going to be a king over God's people, you can't be the total last king. You've got to be a king under the great king. And Saul didn't do that. He disobeyed God. And so Saul's out of the picture. But who did God pick instead? A man after his own heart, King David. So the issue was the real king is a king whose heart is just like God's heart, who would rule just as God rules. A man, in fact, who is ruled by God himself. So the best king, the best regent over this model nation Israel is someone whose heart ticks like God's heart does and reflects God in the flesh. And that was David. Now, if you know the life of David, you're saying to yourself, well, now wait a second. Didn't David mess up an awful lot? Yep. Yeah, I'm still working on that clip we saw from Art of Marriage where she says, I want a guy who, when he messes up the right way. Is that who said it? Mess up the right way. Mess up the right way. That's an oxymoron. There's no right way. Anyway, but he had a heart after God. So when he made decisions and when he thought about the people of Israel and when he ruled, he thought the way God would think. And he consulted with what God would. In a real sense, he was preserving God as king, him just being kind of the co-regent. But there's another interesting thing about David, why this worked out just fine. And it's this. In 2 Samuel 5, just before they're getting to bring the coronation on David, this guy says, the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you'll be ruler over Israel. Shepherd. Now, in the ancient days, a shepherd does not own the sheep. The shepherd does not own the sheep. The shepherd takes care of the sheep for the owner of the sheep. So here now, as David is thinking of himself as a shepherd, because that's what he did. Remember when he slew Goliath? What was he doing as a profession? He was working his dad's family, being a shepherd. So God calls a shepherd who has a heart like himself to say, David, I want you to be king, but I want you to shepherd my people. Because the kingship of God never went away. He just wanted someone to shepherd the flock that did not belong to the King David, but still belonged to God. So in a real sense, when David came into place, he was really shepherd David, and that restored God as being king over Israel. Because David was just taking care of the sheep, not ruling as a king. See the difference? God is still king over Israel while David is king. More like a co-regent, more like a prince in a sense like that too. Did he rule? Yes, he ruled. Did he rule the way God would? Yes, because he had a heart after God. Did he promote and encourage the nation of Israel to see God as their king? Yes, over and over and over. And that's why David did so well, because the King of Kings and Lord of Lords was his king, and he could rule in God's place and directing people to God as king. So God is really king during the time of David as shepherd. This is a long run up to Palm Sunday, isn't it? You got to know the context. So anyway, time goes on, the promise goes past David, but still the promise remains, because remember, it's an everlasting promise. Look what some of the writers, the later prophets, said. Now, this is 400 years after David dies. Jeremiah writes in Jeremiah 23:5, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king and act wisely and do justice and righteousness in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely. And this is his name by which he will be called the Lord our righteousness. Jehovah Tzidkenu, the Lord our righteousness. Now, you and I look back from Jesus' time, and we know who he's talking about. But 400 years after Jesus, the people in Israel are going, what are you talking about? David died 4 centuries ago. What do you mean some guy raise up for David a righteous branch and he'll reign as king and he'll act wisely? So really, after David dies, David was himself a model. A false king, a tiny king? No, a model of a final king who would act in the same way in terms of directing the nation of Israel to God as king, but a ruler beyond compare. But like David, like what was good about David, this ultimate regent will be as well. And we know this is Jesus, just in case you're wondering, who is he talking about? But back 400 years after David dies, Jeremiah is saying this is the intention. The promise remains, and this king is coming who will act wisely. Wow. And he's also called the Lord our righteousness. Now, who would ever have the audacity to call themselves, I am the Lord of righteousness? Maybe on World Federation Wrestling or something you see some, but I mean, that's an audacious claim. You don't make that. But that's who he's going to be called, the Lord our righteousness. This is really an astonishingly big person, whoever it is. Huge, huge expectations. You want to see another one? That's Jeremiah. Here's Ezekiel. About the same time, 400 years after David, Ezekiel writes in Ezekiel 37, verse 24, my servant David will be king over them. Well, it's 400 years after David died. The model David king. Okay, that's what he's talking about. My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. Look at that. So like David was a shepherd of someone else's sheep, and they will walk in my ordinances and keep my statutes and observe them. Verse 25, they'll live on the land that I gave to Jacob my servant, in which your fathers lived. That's the promised Canaan land. And they'll live on it, they and their sons sons forever. And David my servant, again, the model David king, David my servant will be their prince forever. I will make a covenant of peace, a promise of peace with them. And it'll be an everlasting covenant with them. And I'll place them and multiply them and will set my sanctuary in their midst forever. Verse 27, my dwelling place also will be with them. And there's the phrase, and I'll be their God, and they'll be my people. And the nations will know that I am the Lord who sanctifies Israel when my sanctuary is in their midst forever. Do you see the model tribe there? There it is, in the flesh. There it is. The nations will know that this is the plan when you see me, God, living in their midst. This is the plan, and everyone's invited through the blood of Christ. Everyone's invited. But this guy, who is this servant who will be a prince forever? Who's that? Question mark of all question marks of the Old Testament. Who is this man? One last thing. Psalm 2 is probably the most powerful psalm that talks about the nature of this guy, whoever he is, this regent. So powerful, in fact, that, I mean, even when you talk to Jews today and you say, can you show me a psalm about the Messiah? That's who this king is, who this Messiah is. The first thing they'll do is they'll go to Psalm 2. Now watch as we read this. Watch who this guy is, okay? Psalm 2, why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of earth take their stand and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. His anointed. Anointed just means the one that God has chosen and said, you're going to be the guy. Okay? They take their stand against God and his anointed, the Lord and his anointed, saying, well, let's tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. And he who sits in the heavens laughs at these guys. He laughs, and the Lord scoffs at them. And then he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury, saying, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. Zion, by the way, is a code word for Jerusalem. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord, he said to me. You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall shatter them like earthenware. Now therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, that he may not become angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath may soon be kindled. How blessed are all who take refuge in him. You should have goosebumps right now. This is a stern warning to the world, to the kings and the people of power who think they're hot stuff because they've got a nation. Because God's saying, I've installed my king in Zion. And you're making me mad. I laugh at your powerful claims of throwing off the fetters and binding of this one who's really the ruler of the entire universe. I laugh at all this. But you got to understand, I've installed my son on the throne in Zion. And you better not make him mad either. So when a Jew thinks about this coming king who has these mythic proportions of power and control and authority, this one we call the Messiah, they think about him. This is what they think about. They think about this king who will come and bring goodness and protection for the nation of Israel, like David, but uber David, much, much more than David was. A man after God's own heart? Yes. So much more, he actually has God's heart, this Messiah. So much more powerful than David himself. So much more loving than David himself, and compassionate, and one who would always point to the Father. I mean, this is a big guy, and I had a hard time trying to tell you how important the comments about this coming king were throughout the entire Old Testament. That for the Jews, this coming king is everything. He's everything. Huge. The question throughout all of the Old Testament is, who is he? And when will he come? Because when he comes, he's big. He's big stuff. So the question is, who is this guy? And of course, we already used the word Messiah. That's what the Messiah is. The Messiah is this promised king, fundamentally, but more like a prince king, because there is still the king who's the Father in heaven over the owned sheep of Israel and the entire world. He's a king, but he's not a king. He rules, but not ultimately. But yes, ultimately, is he the top person in charge? Well, yes and no. And when we equivocate in all this stuff, that's only because what we're talking about is one of the mysteries of the Trinity, where the Messiah and the Father are so unified, they're one and the same, and yet the Messiah is visibly the leader. But he, like David, is more of a shepherd in that sense. So anyway, big guy with ultimate authority. And he's like David multiplied 1,000 times, okay? This Messiah. So let's take a look, and this is what brings us to Palm Sunday, about some Old Testament hints about who this guy is. And you can actually come up with hundreds of hints about who these guys are, but the ones that apply to Palm Sunday are this. There is a timetable of the coming of this one in Daniel 9. We're going to look at that. A timetable. Yeah. There's also a vehicle that he uses in Zechariah 9. And there's also a coronation that happens according to Psalm 118. So we're going to look at these three things because for a Jew, they all know that these things right here apply to this guy, whoever he is. And it'll be unmistakable when he comes. And that's Palm Sunday. So here we go. We're going to start with the timeline, the timetable from Daniel 9. By the way, Daniel, it was a favorite of Isaac Newton when he studied the Bible. I like that likeness. It's pretty nice. And I like the curls. I think they're natural. But anyway, Isaac Newton was not only just a great mathematician and scientist and an eater of apples. I don't know. But anyway, in fact, by the way, I won't get into that. So Newton was a big Bible studier. He studied the Bible an awful lot. And he went on record saying that if there's one place in the entire Bible that you can prove the truthfulness and the veracity of the Bible, it's Daniel. And specifically, Daniel 2 through 9. So we're going to dive into Daniel 9 right now. In fact, as you come out of this, it turns out that for years, people used to criticize, modern skeptics would criticize the Bible, and they'd criticize Daniel in specific and say, well, these prophecies in Daniel clearly were written after the fact, because they're just too close to what really happened. Daniel must have been written historically many, many years after we think it was written. It's a forgery, because the predictions and the prophecies in Daniel are just too close. And they'd laugh. They'd say it's, forged. Until they dug up the Dead Sea Scrolls, which predate a lot of the history that Daniel predicts. And they said, oh, never mind. It's powerful. So we're going to dive into one of those today. We don't have time to cover all of Daniel. Maybe someday we'll do that because it really, I got to tell you, it's mind-blowing what's there. But Daniel 9 is very particular to Palm Sunday. Let's see what he says. Okay, Daniel 9 verse 25 is where we're diving in. We're coming in way out of context, so I'm going to trust you're going to go back and check up on me on this. Daniel 9:25. So you're to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, Mashiach Nagid, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Now let me tell you what's going on right here. This is actually an angel of God whose name is, you recognize it, Gabriel. Same guy who made a guest appearance with Mary. So Gabriel's coming. He's explaining a dream that King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, had. And Daniel's in this position to interpret the king's dreams. And Daniel says, God, you got to tell me what this dream means so I can inform Nebuchadnezzar. This is part of what Gabriel is telling Daniel. And he had this bizarre dream. But in the midst of this dream, Gabriel says, here's a timetable for you, okay? There is a time between the issuing of a decree, that's a royal decree, to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Because, by the way, at this time, Daniel is in captivity in Babylon, and they've destroyed Jerusalem. The place is a shambles. They're in captivity. From the time that some king dude says, restore and rebuild Jerusalem, until the Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah, the reigning prince, comes. He comes on the scene. He's there. Poof, there he is going to be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So you're saying, wait, like 7 plus 62 is 69, okay? So 69 weeks after someone says builds the city and then the Messiah is going to show up? Well, not quite. What you have to understand is the word for weeks is a general word for sevens, groups of sevens. And it actually, week really means 7 years. And this is commonly interpreted, even the rabbis all the way to Protestant and Catholic Christians, they all interpret this way because it's used that way very many times. So week means a 7 years, means a 7 of something, and in this case, 7 years. So if you're into math, or not, so if a week means 7 years, then the 7 weeks at the beginning is 7 times 7 is 49, and the 62 weeks, the 62 7 years is 434, and the 6 weeks, the week plus the 62 weeks, if you add those together, comes out to 483 years. So what he's saying is that between the time some king gives a decree to rebuild Jerusalem, because at this point Jerusalem's a wreck, someone allows the Jews to go back. From that decree, start your timer, start your watch, because in 483 years, the Messiah Prince will show up. He'll show up. Set your calendar. You can do this. And if you're really into math, you'll find out that these 483 years actually turn out into 173,880 days.
How many hours is that?
I don't know. But the interesting thing is, we know exactly on the calendar when a king decreed that Jerusalem should be rebuilt. I mean, we've got it. It's a very strange thing, but and no one disagrees on it. They've got the day, the actual day that this king made this. So you can take that date, get out your calendars, at 173 plus days, 103,000 plus days, and you come up to a day, and you know what day you get? Palm Sunday. Well, wait, shouldn't it be the day that Jesus is born? No, because on Palm Sunday, Jesus does something he never does in his entire ministry. He presents himself as the ruler, as the king, as the prince, and as the Messiah. That's the day. Everyone who was in Jerusalem at the time, and even all their ancestors, should have been able to say, okay, I'll put in my extra batteries.
Okay.
Yeah, but we don't trust them.
I think your cord might be messed up.
There we go. One of the best things about Boy Scouts. Tempting. There we go. Okay, so that's the very day that he comes into Jerusalem. And he comes in such a way as to make it an unmistakable serving of notice that the king is here. On the very day. Now, what I was just saying was that the fact that the Jews were accounting people. They should have been able to do this math. And even if they made some wrong presumptions, I mean, this math can be done without knowing anything in the modern age. You don't have to know anything in the modern age. In fact, because we have calculators and we're in the modern age, it's actually a slight problem for us to calculate this. For instance, you have to know that for them, the ancient year was 360 days, not 365 and a quarter days. Well, we're scientific. Well, no, they always thought of a year as 360 days. That was it. So if you use 360-day years and you just start doing the math, They should have known this. When they translated the Old Testament and made new copies of the New Testament, passed forward new copies of the Old Testament, they would count the letters of the Old Testament that they had just put on goat skins, and they would count from the end and from the beginning of their copies until they got to what was the middle letter. And if the middle letter wasn't the same as the middle letter of the one they copied it from, they'd destroy this. They were counters. They were counters. The Jewish tradition of counting is big. And so Daniel has a revelation from Gabriel in your dream. He says, 173,880 days after the king makes a declaration to rebuild Jerusalem, Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah Prince, will show up on the scene. And on Palm Sunday, he did. He did. In fact, it's very interesting. If you read the multiple accounts of Palm Sunday, one of the accounts, I can't remember which now, so you can find out for me. One of the accounts shows Jesus coming into Jerusalem and then making a beeline for the temple. He does something very briefly at the temple. We don't know what it was. And then he turns around and he leaves town quickly and goes back to a city he was living in the day before. It's like, what did you do that for? It sounds like you just came in to fulfill some kind of appointment and go out. Yes, he came in to fulfill an appointment and went out because this day had to happen. Had to. And the Jews should have known it. They were not clueless. They should have known this. Even if they got it off by a little bit. They should have known basically the month and the year and maybe the week. But you can get the actual day. The actual day. If you want to check up more on this, I don't have time to cover right now. If you Google the 70 weeks of Daniel or the 69th week of Daniel, Google it and find a good reputable kind of Christian source and just see what they say. You can go through the math, you can see all the stuff and find out who made the proclamation. We don't have time to do that today. But there's really very little disagreement about this. Across the whole width of people who are Bible students, they say, no, that's what it is. The Jews had no excuse. They knew the week and the day. And the day. He had to come into town. After this, it says, amazingly in this prophecy from Daniel 9:25, the Messiah will be cut off. What does that mean? Well, go to Isaiah 53, clearly a section of Isaiah about the Messiah. He was cut off out of the land of the living. And that's what cut off means. It means to be excluded from something. When it just says cut off, it means cut off from life. That's what it means. So Daniel's prophecy says, this guy will present himself as Mashiach Nagid, the Prince Messiah, the guy in all the Old Testament who's the all-powerful everything, whose kingdom will never end. And then he'll die. What? Does that make any sense? This is the all-powerful Messiah. Gabriel says to Daniel, yeah, he'll be cut off. To the Jews, that didn't make any sense for a long time. If he's the all-powerful, if he's the guy that we just read in Ezekiel and Jeremiah and so much of the Old Testament, he can't die, can he? And then Gabriel goes on and says something else interesting. The people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The city clearly is Jerusalem. That's all. Whenever you see the city, it's Jerusalem. Just like when we lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, when someone said, I went to the city last night. That meant you went to San Francisco. Well, the city in the Old Testament without specification is always Jerusalem. Well, here's the funny thing. It says, the people of the prince who is to come. That is some other ruler, not this big guy, but some other ruler. Wait. How can you have another ruler? He's the only ruler. Some other ruler will come, and he'll come from some other people, and his people will destroy the city and the sanctuary. What's the sanctuary? God's temple. And so you say, okay, so let me get this straight. Mashiach Nagid comes into town and presents himself. Shortly thereafter, he's killed, and shortly thereafter, the entire city is destroyed, including the temple. Is that what you're trying to tell me? That's what's there. In one verse, it's there. See why Isaac Newton loved Daniel? There's even more. In Daniel, if you want to go and look at it yourself, which you're always welcome to do, Daniel predicts an ongoing succession of 4 kingdoms that are going to come on the earth and describes them in enough detail that they match very closely 4 kingdoms that were all world kingdoms that came after that, ending with the 4th one being Rome. Whoa. So anyway, someday we'll get to that. So the prince who is to come, who is that? Do you know who that is? The prince who is to come? The Antichrist. Ooh, yeah. The people of the prince who is to come. And this is one of the principal places that people who love to talk about end times Bible topics will say that when the Antichrist comes, he's going to come out of Rome, or the extension of Rome, because in just a second you'll see the people who destroyed Jerusalem and the temple was Rome. And this is where they get it from. So, you're getting a lot today. Okay, let's move on to the vehicle. So we have the timetable. On Palm Sunday, we know exactly the day he comes into town, and we know that he fulfilled that to the day. Oh, by the way, we can pinpoint the day, the very day that Jesus came into in this Palm Sunday, pretty simply because it talks about that Jesus started his ministry in a certain time in Tiberius, who was king, when he was king of Caesar, that is. And you can actually get a date pretty easily done because we know that Passover is only on a certain date in the Jewish calendar that follows the phases of the moon. So we can pretty much come up with a darn good, accurate day for when he came in on Palm Sunday because it's tracked to when Passover was, and that's tracked to the moon, and we can track the phases of the moon, and we got the day. So anyway, that's kind of fun. Let's talk about the vehicle, Zechariah 9:9. You've probably seen this, Zechariah 9:9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, that's the Jews. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem, that's the Jews. Behold, your king is coming to you. He's just, he's endowed with salvation, humble, and mounted on a donkey, even on the colt, the foal of a donkey. Say what? Now, if you read comics or you like fantasy literature, kings come on big white horses, right? I mean, they have these big swords in their hands, right? And they come in battle, and the big white horse, and the horse goes, right, and all that kind of stuff. Horses were symbols of military power. So when a king came into town, he came on his military power machine, a horse, right? Only backwoods ne'er-do-well kings come in on donkeys. In fact, it's a sign of disrespect in a way. When Rome would go and conquer a people and they would bring back as captives the king or the generals of that country, they brought them into town when they brought them back to Rome to humiliate them one of two ways. They either walked them in the head of the procession in chains, or they put them on the backs of donkeys. Like a mocking, like here's the guy who's in charge of their nation, and he's now on a donkey. Yeah, right. So it's a very diminutive statement. But look at more than just the donkey. He's coming to you. He's coming to you. He's just, and he's endowed with salvation. Endowed with salvation, don't think LDS endowment, please. Think of the idea that he's bringing with him the ability to save. And that's what, if you were being held captive in a foreign land and your king and your general of your hometown realized that you're being held captive and he was going to come rescue you and he'd come into town with a sword and all of his soldiers are going to pop you out of the jail in the foreign land and, my general's here, he's going to save us and bring us back home. He would come endowed with salvation. He would come with the ability to bring you salvation, to save you out of this foreign jail. That's what he's talking about. So this king that's on this little donkey, he's come to actually release you from the captivity of your enemies. But he's on a donkey. And on top of that, he's on a baby donkey. It's the worst you can think of. It's horrible. But this is what Zechariah is saying. Your king. Now, Zechariah is a late enough prophet, time-wise. He's at the end of the Old Testament in a sense that when you talk about the king, you're talking the Messiah. There's just no question. So here's how you can spot him, he said. He'll come into town and he'll present himself riding on a baby donkey. Hard to spot him? No, I don't think so. You'll know when he comes. All the false kings that come into town, if they're not riding a baby donkey, they're not the guy. So wait until you see a guy coming into town acting like a returning king, and he'll be riding on a baby donkey, and that's going to be your clue. I mean, it really can't get much simpler than that. You don't have to talk symbology at all. This is just what Zechariah says. To the Jews, they'd look at this and go, before Jesus, they would agonize and say, well, maybe the donkey symbolizes and the baby donkey symbolizes, and then together, when he says bring salvation, and then they would do all these rationalizations to try and explain away how it is their great and most powerful king would come in like this. And the stories would just make you laugh until you realize, no, just read it the way it is. Just that, and you'll get the clue. So that's his vehicle. Right there, a baby donkey. A baby donkey. So we have the timetable. We have the day, the actual day of the week and the year that he should come up. We have the vehicle he'll be riding when he comes. And now we have the coronation words that will be used when he comes into town. And this comes from Psalm 118, verses 22 to 26. I'm going to read these backwards. I'm going to start at 25 and 26 and go up, and you'll see why. So here it is. This is the coronation words you use. O Lord, do save, we beseech you. O Lord, we beseech you, do send prosperity. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. You've heard that, right, on Palm Sunday many times. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Who can actually come in the name of the Lord? Only someone who is specifically sent by God himself, Yahweh, the real king of Israel. Someone comes and they're sent by that king, the real ruler and owner of the nation of Israel, and actually all the peoples of the earth, okay? Blessed is the one who comes in his name. So he comes into town saying, I'm being sent from God. Blessed is he, that's the guy. So whenever you would say, especially that last phrase for someone who would, like if someone just walked in the door right now, and if we were all to stand up and put our hands in the air and say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Do you know what you just said about that person? He's God's direct representative for your benefit. God sent him here today. But he's more than that. He's the king as well. Because, O Lord, do save, we beseech you. O Lord, we beseech you, do send prosperity. This is a plea for this all-powerful one to save. So that person who walks in the door also has the ability to save you from whatever's plaguing you right now. Now, it's just not an idle thing. So here's someone who's sent specifically from God to rescue you from the captivity of your enemies. And so when someone walks into your presence and you say that, you're saying, that's the guy. That's the guy. Now, if you happen to just, be out somewhere, like in a mall or something, and you hear someone else say that about someone else, these crowds of people just say, oh, blessed he who comes in the name of the Lord, then you'd have to say, these people think that that guy is the Savior of the world and the all-powerful one sent by God on our behalf. And then you'd have to choose at that point. Are these people just crazy? They've been sitting in the food court too long here in the mall? Or do they know something I don't know? Because that label is a specific identifier that they think he is the Mashiach Nagid. He's the Messiah Prince. I'm going to go backwards because I don't know if you knew this, but Psalm 118 has a whole bunch of other very famous passages that you know about that just precede this. This is cool. Watch this. Heard this one? This is the day the Lord has made. Let's rejoice and be glad in it. Yeah. Because throughout the entirety of Psalm 118, when you read the context, he's talking about the fact that God has saved me in a previous context. He came to my side and he rescued me from what was going on. And so when he gets to the end of the psalm, he says, so let's continue to remind ourselves that God is the one who will save. He will come to our side and aid us when we need him. He's the one that saves. He will send somebody and we'll do this. So today is not a day that we need to be sour. We need to realize that this is his day. We can rejoice regardless of the circumstance. And if we go up a little bit more, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It's marvelous in our eyes. Those two verses, 22 and 23, get repeated many times in the New Testament. Because when you build a building, the first thing you put down is the cornerstone. And from that, you lay out the lines for the walls and the entire structure and its position and placement. So from an ancient thinking, even a current thinking, the cornerstone is the beginning of everything, and everything leans on that as a foundational position. The cornerstone is the beginning and the start of everything that's built on top of it. But he's saying something about this one who brings salvation. He'll be a stone that the builders who are trying to build this house will totally reject. They won't even see, they won't even value who he is. But from God's perspective, he always has been and will be the cornerstone, the foundation start of the entire thing. When it's quoted in the New Testament, it's quoted in terms of Jesus being the one that the builders, that is the Pharisees, the religious leaders who are trying to build their own house of religion for the world. They completely missed him. And God's perspective was Jesus was always meant to be the cornerstone of that structure. And the Jews missed it. The stone that was rejected. Even Peter, oh gosh, read Acts 4 today if you get a chance. This is great. I'd forgotten about this. Acts 4, Peter and John are doing some of their early preaching outside. They're in Jerusalem at the time. They're in the hotbed right here. They're in Jerusalem. And Peter gets up there and starts this incredible sermon. And it's there. It's not very long. And he talks about it. And he quotes this. He quotes this. And he says, you know who that stone is that you rejected? And right in their face, he says, he's Jesus that you crucified. That's how he says it. Jesus, whom you crucified. And then right after that, he says, yeah, the same Jesus that God raised from the dead. You got to read this. I mean, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. But he quotes this right here. The stone that the builders rejected is Christ himself. And he was so rejected by you Pharisees, you killed him. But no big deal, God raised him from the dead. Read Acts 4. It's a mind blower. So here's Psalm 118 telling us that whoever says basically, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. That's the coronation words right there. You're thinking he is the Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah Prince right there. So now let's come to Palm Sunday. Woo! Luke 19. You needed to know all of that so as you stand with the crowd during Palm Sunday, all this stuff will be in your head and you go, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Here we go. Luke 19, we're going to use the Luke account. Luke 19:28. After Jesus had said these things, he was going on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. He's out of Jerusalem right now. In fact, this view from the southeast of it's kind of recreation of what Jerusalem looked like, according to our favorite artist, Tissot. He's actually standing on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is elevated right here, goes off to your right as a ridge. And he's standing right on the very road that you would take if you're going to come into Jerusalem from the east. And in fact, specifically from a couple of little burgs called Bethphage and Bethany. So here we go. When he approached Bethphage and Bethany, so he's actually before that, behind us, near the mount that is called Olivet, Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples saying this, go into the village ahead of you there, and as you enter, you'll find a colt tied on which no one has yet ever sat. Untie it, bring it here, and if anyone asks you, hey, why are you untying it? You shall say, the Lord has need of it. Ring a bell yet? And so, the story goes on, verse 32, so those who were sent away and found it just as he had told them, and as they were untying the colt, sure enough, its owner said to him, hey, I threw the hay in because I think it needs to be there. Why are you untying the colt? And they said, the Lord has need of it. And that did it. They brought it to Jesus, and they threw on their coats on the colt and put Jesus on it. And suddenly, a king is on a baby donkey. And he's just about ready to do one of the most visible processions into a city in the ancient world that has ever happened. The Mount of Olives runs as a ridge, kind of like the Wasatch Range does right here. It goes north and south. It's just east of Jerusalem. And so when he's at Bethphage and Bethany, he's on the other side of that ridge. In a second, after he's mounted the colt on the other side of the ridge, he's going to come around that point where we saw Jerusalem a second, and he's going to descend down the face of that ridge right in full view of Jerusalem and the temple and all the religious leaders. And hundreds, if not thousands of people will see him coming down this hillside in grand spectacle with palm branches and people singing and all this kind of stuff. And everyone in Jerusalem will look out and say, what's that? It's the most in-your-face entrance you can make at any time in Jerusalem. And in just a moment, he's going to do that on the back of a foal, a colt, saying without any equivocation, he's the guy. The story unfolds, verse 36. And as he was going, they were spreading their coats on the road. And as soon as he was approaching near the descent, that's the face that can be seen from Jerusalem, the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the miracles which they had seen. In another gospel, we know all the miracles really means the raising of Lazarus. That's why all those people were there, it says. And they were shouting the coronation words. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven, glory in the highest. So according to that crowd, the guy on the colt is the king, the Mashiach Nagid, the fulfillment of everything that had been said in the Old Testament. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. This guy isn't just some king. He is the king sent by God himself, who is endowed with salvation. And that's what they're saying. And everyone in Jerusalem is peering over the walls And they might actually be able to hear this, but there's this huge commotion with all these people. They can sense he's riding on a very diminutively small animal. And then as the people in Jerusalem are watching, I think many of them kind of elbowed each other and says, is that a donkey? Is that like a really small donkey? Is that like a baby donkey? And suddenly all these words of the Old Testament, they're coming together saying, wait a second. This guy is making a claim right now. He is making the claim. And what's that they're saying? What, did you hear that? Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Oh my gosh, they think he's the king too. And he proceeds down the face of the Mount of Olives in full view of everyone on the temple side of Jerusalem so they can see him and say, who does this guy think he is? That's what the leaders said, because they'll say that later. But there's some leaders who went out to the Mount of Olives on that other side. They left town to go up and see what was stirring up there, because there was a gob of people that came over the hill and started coming down the face, a gob of people. So they went out to check it out. Here's Jesus as he comes in, led on a colt of a donkey, and people praising him and saying this coronation word. Now, some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." Now, why would they say that? Why didn't they just say, the king's here. Yes, let's all praise him. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. No, because for the Pharisees, they looked at Jesus and they said, Jesus is no king. Come on. He's never been the king. Who do you think he is? And so the Pharisees are thinking, and they're giving a little benefit of the doubt, that maybe Jesus' apostles are they're just really excited. They kind of went over the top. They're calling him the king. That's just wrong. That's just wrong. Teacher, straighten him out. Tell him you're not the king. Come on. This is crazy. Jesus' response, I tell you, if these became silent, the stones will cry out. I love that picture, little stones with little teeth in them. That is kind of scary, actually. Yeah. But Jesus is making it very clear. What is happening right now has to happen right now. It's a fulfillment of prophecies. This is the day. I'm on the donkey. They're saying the right word. It's got to happen. This has been prophesied. It's going to happen right now, today, right now. This is the moment. And if these people missed it, at least the rest of creation isn't so stupid to miss it. Yeah, even the rocks. It's his way of backhanded saying, you're dumber than a bag of rocks. Really? Really? This is exactly what this insult meant to the Pharisees. You are dumber than a bag of rocks. You're missing it. You're absolutely missing it. Because if these people didn't say it, all of creation would open its mouth and go, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's the guy. That's the guy. That's the guy. He's on the right day. He's on the right animal. The people are saying the right thing. He's coming into Jerusalem. And he said all along through his 3 years of public ministry, he was the guy. He just said, don't tell anybody yet, because I need to make a big public announcement, or else, it'll set the fuse, it'll get me killed too early. But today, he's not being quiet. He's doing it unmistakably. He's riding in. That's why Palm Sunday is so important. So when he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city, and he wept over it. I've always, when I stopped there, I've always thought, what an amazing thing. He wept over it. You would think that he would come into town as the king. He knew who he was, and either be a little miffed that people didn't recognize him, or he would be happy that the people right around him recognized him and knew who he was. Something, but I would never expect this. So why does he weep when he sees Jerusalem? By the way, he's coming down the face of that hill. Right here is where you turn the corner and go to the right. So you're in full view of the temple. The temple's right there behind that wall you see. I know, that's a great recreation. This is Tissot's version of the temple right up here. So he comes right there. And not only can the people in Jerusalem look out over the wall, out from the big temple complex that's on this east end of the city, not only can they look across and see the face of the hill of the Mount of Olives, but Jesus looks back as well. And this is Jim's sanctified imagination, I've always imagined that when he looked across to the city right here, he wasn't looking across at those walls. He was looking across at the people peering over the walls who were saying to each other, who does he think he is? And it breaks his heart. And he weeps over this city. But he knows more than just that. You see right here, he says, if you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they've been hidden from your eyes. But the days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you like a siege wall and surround you and hem you in on every side. And they'll level you to the ground and your children within you. And they will not leave in you one stone upon another because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. Because you missed it, he says, your city will be razed. Your city will be razed. And we know from the other passage, and so will your temple. Because you missed me. You missed when the king came into town. Because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. That's where we're going to stop today. But can you see where all those Old Testament anticipations were building toward the coming of this one? They were unmistakable. The day was easily calculated. The vehicle with this baby donkey was easily recognizable, and the people around him who followed him even said the magic words, "Blessed he who comes in the name of God." This is the guy. This is the guy. And yet, they didn't recognize the day of their visitation. That word visitation, by the way, means when a high authority figurehead comes and visits you out of his goodwill. Sure enough, in 70 AD, the city was razed. There was a Roman siege wall that was built around it. There was a rebellion amongst the Jews against Rome that started in 66 AD. And 4 years later, it had gotten to such a fever pitch that the Romans sent a whole bunch of soldiers. And instead of attacking the rebel zealot Jews in 70 AD, going inside the city, they just built a siege wall around it. Remember Jesus says, "There'll build a wall around you"? They built a siege wall around it and basically just starved them out. Very popular way of doing things. Your soldiers can all sit outside in their cozy little tents, eat, drink, and be merry, and just wait for the people inside to die or give up. That was 70 AD, led by Titus. By the way, Titus brought 70,000 soldiers to do that. There's an incredible irony about that number, because you remember the night when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane? Remember that? He's arrested in the dark by all those people. And remember, Peter goes, swing, whoop, and cuts off the ear of the priest servant Malchus. Remember that? So that's great swordsmanship. He lost an ear. Jeez. And then Jesus picks up the ear, super glues it back on the side of his head. He puts it on somehow like that. And which, amazing, is not talked about very much. I would have talked about that a lot. Yeah. But he sticks it back on. And then he turns to Peter and he says to Peter, "Listen, if you use the sword, you'll die by the sword. Don't you know that I could ask the Father right now for 12 legions of angels?" A legion is 6,000 angels. 12 times 6,000 is 72,000. Interestingly enough, Jesus could have mustered the same size army of angels that Titus brought and took down the city 40 years later. And yet, the Mashiach Nagid had to be cut off. He had to die. Because that's what Jesus says to Peter after that. It's got to go down this way so that the prophecies come true. This is the way it's meant to be. Put away your sword. So he came on time. He used the right vehicle. The coronation words were said. Everything was in place. Now, if you think that the 70 AD siege of Rome didn't really exist, you can go to Rome today. You can fly to Rome, and you'll see this there. This is it's called the Arch of Titus. It was built in, I think, 82 AD. And it was built to commemorate Titus's success over destroying Jerusalem in 70 AD. It was put there by the successor, I think it was his brother that put it up. Yeah, Domitian, who was Caesar at the time, to honor his brother Titus. To celebrate the fact that Titus went into town and completely destroyed Jerusalem and its temple in 70 AD. You can go, this is still there to this very day, you can touch it. And if you go around one side of it and you zoom up on the carvings on the side of this arch, you'll see this. What are they carrying right there? The menorah. The very menorah that was taken out of the temple. And if you look more on here, you'll see other things. Here's the trumpets that were used to sound what was going to go on there. The table of showbread is there. I think this thing right here they call the table of showbread. I mean, all these golden implements and stuff like that. This really happened. The ark's not there because the ark wasn't there. Oh, that's a whole other story that you have to ask Indiana Jones about. But this But this right here, this picture of the menorah is really the only ancient picture we have of what the menorah looked like inside the temple in time. In fact, when Israel first minted its own money, and they wanted to put a picture of that menorah on there, they used this picture as their way of doing that. By the way, this arch right here, the Jews, ever since it was put up in 82 AD, refused to walk under because it was a sign of domination of the Jews. Interestingly, in 1947, when Israel became a nation, a group of Jews decided that they were going to reverse what Rome had done to them. So they lined up on the back side of this, and they walked through it backwards to symbolize the reversing of the captivity. Interesting. But the problem still is, who's your king? For the Jews as well as for us, who's your king? And that's going to determine everything, because it was the fact that they didn't recognize who he was when they came in that caused their destruction in the end. And that's how we finish today. Who's your king? Now, a lot of people will say, oh, you tell me all I have to do is just believe in Jesus. Okay, I believe he was Jesus. I believe in the historical Jesus that walked here. Well, so did everybody else in Jerusalem at the time. They believed there was a Jesus. But did they believe he was the Mashiach Nagid? Did they believe he was the Messiah Prince? Did they believe he was the one who was endowed with salvation and only him? Did they believe that he came to free them from the captivity of their enemies? By the way, your enemy is not Rome, it's Satan and sin and death. Do you believe all that stuff? Have you submitted yourself to that king to say, I want to be part of your kingdom and your plans? When I pray the model prayer, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Are you saying that to this king? Is that what your prayer is? Have you submitted your will to him? It's not just a verbal agreement in the historical presence of who Jesus was. It's to say, he's my king. I want to be part of that kingdom. I want you to be my God, and I want to be your people. Back to the Old Testament promise. And it all happens because of the Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah Prince, who came on the right day, on the right vehicle, with the right words, on that day. And on Palm Sunday, for the first time in his entire public ministry, he came into town and he said, I'm the guy. And it got him killed. He was cut off. But he's coming back. Why? To fulfill the promise that we might have this society and community with God at the center, and him as our prince. And that's why if there was no Palm Sunday, it wouldn't matter about Easter, because the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords voluntarily sacrificed himself, cut off, so that he could equip us through his blood to be citizens in that new kingdom. Palm Sunday fits right there. Are there any more slides? No. That means I got to stop talking, so let's pray. Lord, you are our King. And from you, you provide life for us, just like a king. Protection, provision, loving kindness. It's like it says back in those passages we read, you delight to set up your camp in our midst, to live amongst us. And Lord, we realize that that kingdom starts right now as we give our allegiance to this king. But Lord, we await the day that you will return again and put a finish to sin, put a finish to death and sorrow, and that the fulfillment of this promise would reach its height. But until that day, we are proud to call you our King. We're proud to rely on you and depend on you for all that we need for life. We are proud to lay ourselves in the hands of your loving kindness, because your love is faithful to us. Thank you that you are our King and our Savior and our Prince. Amen.